This is what you're going to build by the end of this video series. All right, so this is the third video in this series, and we are going to be focusing on data storage. In the current state of things, we are storing Wordle results in memory inside of a variable that's an array of all the results that we have. And if we ever stop running the bot, those will go away. So we need something that's more persistent, and that's where a database is going to come into play. So to get set up, we're going to switch on over to Visual Studio Code back in our project and start getting things set up for a database to use. All right, first things first, we need to install and add the dependencies for the databases that we're going to be using. We're going to be using libsql, so we need the database driver for that. And then we're going to be using Drizzle ORM, or object relational mapping, which is going to help us set up the schema and the database structure that we want and apply that to the libsql database for us. Drizzle is also going to help us out with simplifying the code that we write to execute queries against the database. So think of things like creating entities or rows in the database, or updating the values within those rows, that type of thing. All right, first thing we need to do is install the dependencies, right? So with bun, we're going to say bun add, but if you're using npm, you could say npm install. We're going to say at libsql/client and then drizzle-orm. And what that's doing, if you're not familiar, you can actually install multiple packages at once instead of one at a time. So we're saying install this package, libsql client and drizzle-orm. I'm going to hit enter and we're good to go. Okay, so now those are installed, we can start setting up the code to leverage those. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to our env file, click on that to open it up. We're going to add a new environment variable, and we're going to call it db_file_name. All right, and we're going to set that equal to file:/local.db. What that essentially means is we're going to be just using a local file within the project structure as the database for now. Now that we have that going, let's start writing the code. Within the src folder, we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it db, and that way we can isolate all of our database files and code within that folder. So from there, we're going to add a new index.ts file, and now we're going to start adding the code to that. So for this, I'm going to copy over the code that's from the README tutorial, and we'll talk about what's happening here. So first of all, we are importing the Drizzle ORM libsql object here, and then the create client functionality from libsql client. And then these two other things we're going to skip over for now. I'll explain those shortly. And the main piece here is we're setting up a new libsql client to connect to the database, and we're passing in a URL parameter or argument. As the value of that, we're getting that environment variable. The file:/local.db is the DB file name. And then from there, we set up the Drizzle client using that libsql client, passing that into this function here, Drizzle, pass in the client, and then the schema, so that way our DB is now accessible via the DB variable that we're assigning that to, DB being database. All right, so speaking of all that schema, let's create a new file in the DB folder here. We're going to call it schema.ts, and then let's add the code for that. I'm going to copy that from the README and paste it in here, and let's talk about what's happening. And one thing to call out right away that probably stands out to you is that this function here, the SQLite table, is crossed out. And this is VS Code indicating to me, based on the API from SQLite core here, that this particular function, it has been deprecated or is going to be deprecated, and they're going to be basically changing the syntax around, it looks like, a little bit. So this is a good point to call out that Drizzle ORM, while it works great and I've had success with this, I've built this out already, and this is just me rebuilding it with you all in the video. It is not in full release yet in the sense of version 1.0. The current version that I just installed, and you likely may install be different here, is Drizzle ORM 0.38.2. And the one when I built this originally with this code that you see here was 0.37.0 or something like that. So already we can see some changes happening here. So be cautious with using this. Maybe you want to use a separate ORM like Prisma if you'd like, that's more stable at this point in the game. But this is a fun technology to use that's up and coming in this area of development. That said, we're going to look past this for the time being because this is the code that was working. And if I need to, I will just revert back to 0.37.0 if needed here. And we'll step through that together. Okay. So what's happening is we are using the Drizzle ORM relations function here. And then from the Drizzle ORM SQLite core, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, libsql is basically SQLite, but some added capabilities on top of that there. So there's some parity between the two is what I'm getting at here. So we set up each table individually. So the tables we're going to need is a table that holds the Wordle data. So like what Wordle game number has been out and released across the globe type of thing. Then how many players there are that play for each Wordle, and then the scores for those players. And then we need to talk about the relationships between these entities that define each of them. So when it comes to Wordles, there's always going to be a single instance of a Wordle based on the game number. So Wordle number 1237, let's say. And then with the players table, we're going to have the Discord ID and their Discord name so that we can capture that and be able to look up people and show that data however we need to or would like to. And then last, the scores table it's using the Discord ID referencing the players table Discord ID. And then the same thing for game number. This is the game number referencing the Wordle table and the game number from that. And then we take into account when it comes to scores, we're talking about how many attempts somebody used to complete that Wordle. And if they fail, it could be like X. So that's why we're using a text option here for that type, because it could be numbers 1 through 6, or if you fail completely, that shows up as an X from the Wordle. And then we're capturing this so that it makes it easier for us to know when you're playing against other players, did you win? Did you get it in the least number of attempts versus everybody else that played that exact Wordle? Or did you tie? Did other people get the same number of attempts? So maybe everybody got it in 3, or more than one person got it in 3 attempts. That would be considered a tie in this case. And then we define the primary key here for this, defining that the columns that create that primary key are from the Discord ID and game number columns, if you will, for the scores table. Okay, so that's defining the columns and the data that we're going to be capturing for each table that we have: Wordles, players, and scores. Now let's talk about the relationships between them. So when it comes to players, players can have many scores, right? So we define that using that relations function that we pulled in at the very top, if we go back up there, from the Drizzle ORM library right there. Okay, so we're saying we're defining a relation for the players table. We pull in the many parameter from that the Drizzle ORM is providing to us when we call this function. And then we define it by saying that the scores for the players table relation is a many relationship, meaning players can have many scores. I know it's kind of like hard to think about, but if you just follow this structure, we're defining a relation on the players table to what table and what type of relation is it. So it's a one to many, meaning one player to many scores, right? Then from there, we have the scores table and the scores relations for that. So we have a couple of relations to define here. We're going to define the relations on the scores table. That's what we pass in. And we're going to have a one related relationship to these other tables. So a score can have one player and one Wordle. So the idea here is that a player can have many scores, but a score, like one row of a score, can only have one player defined to it, along with one Wordle, right? So that player's score goes to this Wordle game number 1237, right? And the way that gets defined is you call out the table name, which is player, and then we say that it has a 1-to-1 relationship between this score and the player's table based on these fields. The fields on the scores table, which is the source of what we're defining this relationship on, the Discord ID field for that, which then references the players table, the one we're trying to relate to here, that Discord ID. So as long as those match, then that relation is defined that way. And then in a similar fashion for the Wordle table, we are defining a 1-to-1 relationship here between the Wordles table to the scores table. I know, again, this seems weird because we're defining it for the scores table, but then we have to pull out the fields that we're trying to reference to create that 1-to-1 relationship. So in this case, we're talking about the field on the scores table, the game number column, and that has to reference and match the game number column on the Wordles table. Okay, and that's like the most complex relationship out of all of them right now. And then we go to the Wordle relations, right? The Wordles table relations. We're going to define that. We're going to say it's a 1-to-many rather, for the Wordles to go to scores. So every Wordle game, there can be multiple scores because many players might play that Wordle game. Last but not least here, and then we'll be done with the schema. And there's a lot more to learn here. This is like a very beginner, I would say, approach to a relational database type of structure that we have set up here. And it can get in more bigger, complex applications where you have so many other entities and relationships and pieces of data you need to store. It can get way overwhelming here, but this should be decent for now for such a simple project. So the last thing we need to do so that we can reference all of these relationships and the fields on these tables when we're running our operations against the database to insert new entities and read them and all that types of things. So this is where we start exporting the types to leverage TypeScript via this setup here. So what we're doing is we're going to say we need to export all these types. We want to export a type of when somebody inserts a Wordle. What are the types that come from that? Well, we infer that from the Wordles table that was defined earlier and infer the insert entities from that. So Drizzle ORM will create that for us and handle that. So we don't have to manually create entities for every type of table that we have in the database here. And the same thing. So select. So whenever you do a select, we have that type for the Wordle, insert player, select player, insert score, select score. Now, the one thing here that I added in this, a lot of times when we're working with this, that we'll see later in the code, when I go to select a score, I want the player to come along with that so I know the Discord ID and the Discord name for when I need to print those out or do something with that player information that's associated with that score. So that's where we added this type, which is an interesting syntax that you can learn more about from the Drizzle ORM documentation. But we're basically saying that this score with select score with relation. So when we go to query a score, we can have it include the player using the select player type that we defined earlier. And that is a very quick overview of the schema to define the database structure. All right, so now that we have the schema set up, we need to create a config file for Drizzle so that it knows how to apply all of this to our project, to the database that we're going to be using for our project. So in the root of the project, we're going to create a new file called drizzle.config.ts. All right, so we're going to paste in the contents for the config from the tutorial, the README. And when we paste that in, we're going to notice the first mistake I made, okay? I forgot and I skipped a step where we were supposed to install the Drizzle kit library as a dev dependency. So let's go ahead and open up the terminal and do that right now. The way we could do that is bun add or npm install. We're going to do hyphen lowercase d and then Drizzle kit. The lowercase d indicates that it's a dev dependency. When we do that, bam, we have that installed. We're ready to go. And we can see the red squiggly is gone. So let me explain what's happening in the config here. We pull out the define config function. We're going to export here as the default. And then we pass in this object of configuration options here. The first one is out. So when it comes to Drizzle and databases, you can keep track of the history of changes you make to the database over time and where the migrations information about that goes. You define it in this folder, where do you want the output to go? This Drizzle folder, and that'll all be kept there for us. Then you point out where is the schema file for Drizzle to use, what database dialect you're going to be using. In this case, we're saying SQLite, and then the DB credentials where we're going to say, hey, here's the URL to point to that local file local DB file rather, that we were talking about earlier. Speaking of, another thing that I skipped and made a mistake on, so sorry about that, but if you're following along with the tutorial, you would have known this already. We need to, in the root of the project, create a new file, local.db, because that is the actual database file we're going to be using to store the data in. Now that we have all that set up, we can come back to the terminal and we're going to run bunx, which is basically saying, hey, you're going to execute this package as a command line tool, which is the Drizzle kit package. And we're going to give it the argument of push. And what that's going to do is it's going to look at that config file and push all of our changes along with the schema and set up our database in that local file that we defined there. I hit enter and bam, everything got pulled from the schema and then changes applied to the database. So we're good to go in that regard. Now to check and make sure everything is working as expected, let's use another capability from Drizzle kit, which is the studio mode. This is pretty common against a lot of modern ORMs nowadays where you can create a UI to interface with the local DB, because when I click on it, you're going to see VS Code. While I could get an extension that lets me do it directly in VS Code, and you can check that out yourself if you'd like, it's not going to be able to natively show you the contents of the local DB, and you can explore it that way. So what Drizzle kit offers is a studio that creates a UI for you to interact with that. So let's run that command now. Bunx again, Drizzle kit, and we're going to say studio. Once that's done, it's going to say, hey, everything's good to go. You can go to local.drizzle.studio to access the studio UI. So let's go ahead and jump on over to that. All right, once you're in your browser and you go to that URL, you should see something pretty much exactly the same as this. We have on the left-hand side the ability to see the different tables that were defined in the database. Obviously, right now we're seeing zeros because no data was actually added to the database, but we can look at all that structure, and the columns that we had set up in the schema file is now applied right here. So for Wordles, we have the ID, the game number and scores. Here we have Discord ID, game number, attempts, is win, is tie, and then players, Discord ID, Discord name, and then the scores. So what's cool about this is once you have data in there, you can actually click through to these other relationships that we've defined. So when I'm looking at a player, I can click on this, the value that will be in this column, and see the scores related to that player. It's really nice. It's super helpful, and appreciate this feature being part of the Drizzle ORM. All right, so now that we have the database all set up, we can start saving the Wordles to the database instead of saving it to an array in memory in the code here. So let's start changing our code to do that. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go into the src, the index.ts file in src folder, and we're gonna start making changes here. First of all, at the top, we need to import our database modules. So we have from the DB, we're gonna import star as DB, and then from the schema, we're gonna import this as well. And we'll see how those get used in just a moment. So now we're gonna go down here on line 19 where we had that array, the in-memory one that we're storing them from, and we're gonna delete this. Let's get rid of it. Then we need to go to the function process latest Wordle result, line 57, and now we can see some of the red squigglies from TypeScript and VS Code telling us, hey, there is no such thing as Wordle results, and this is where we're gonna start changing things up. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna insert code that's going to leverage code that we actually haven't implemented yet that's going to talk to the database. But I wanted to flow through this so that we can see exactly how we're changing things from the original logic to the new logic using a database. So what we're going to do first is remove this and replace it with a check against the database to see if there's an existing result for this user by Discord ID and then Wordle by game number. Paste in the first line here, and you could see we're awaiting DB. So we're using that DB entity from earlier. We're going to call a function that says get scores by game number. So we have the parsed Wordle that was passed in here from the Discord message, and we're going to pass in the game number field off of that. Next up is we want to check all of those because this is the scores for the current game number based on the parsed Wordle we received. Let's see if there is an existing result for this user that's based on the Discord ID. So now that we have that, we're going to say scores for current game, find a score, and we're using that type select score with relations because we want the player to go along with it, as I mentioned earlier, and we can get the score Discord ID matches the parsed Wordle that was passed into this function Discord ID. Next, we're going to replace all of this here, right? So we're going to move all this and replace it with this code. So just like before, we check to see if there isn't an existing result for this user that was part of this parsed Wordle, then we need to go through the flow of creating that, right? So the first thing we're going to try and do is if that player, just in case that player doesn't exist in the database already, let's create that player in the player table using the Discord ID and username from the parsed Wordle that was received in the message. Then we are going to check the scores for current game. And if there aren't any, meaning the array length is 0, then we need to go and create that Wordle for that game number. So if it's Wordle 1237 and nobody else has already submitted a result in the Discord channel for that Wordle game, then we need to create that Wordle as well in the database. But we don't want to do that if it's already been created from somebody previously. So that's why we check to see if the length is 0. Then we need to add that score for this user and that Wordle. So we go to DB create score, passing in the Discord ID, the game number, and the total number of attempts that this user had for that particular Wordle. And we get back from that database the added score that was completed and entered into the database. Then we check, okay, if that came back successfully, then in our current array of scores for the current game that we're working with here, again, example, Wordle 1237, let's say, let's push that onto it so that we can work with that in memory without having to make another database call to get all the latest scores for the current Wordle that we're working with here, okay? And then if it was already added, then we're gonna, or not if it was already added, but rather if there was an issue adding that score, we're gonna log an error saying there was an issue doing that with the database. Otherwise, getting back here to this if statement, right? If it does exist, right, it is not undefined. We found an existing result for the user. Somebody's trying to create a duplicate. We're just gonna ignore that, log it out for our own purposes so we can keep track of that thing, and then return the array of current games, or current scores rather, for this game of Wordle, 1237. Now we need to go to the process current results function and make some changes here. So it's going to use the database data instead of the Wordle result array like we were doing before. So the first thing we need to do is change this type to be the scores with relations. Select scores with relations type. We'll notice we'll start getting some more squigglies there that we'll fix in a moment here. Then we need to update the winners variable type to be that as well. So we're going to change this like that. Paste that in. Now we can go to the determine winners function. So I'm going to control click in that, or you could just scroll down. We're going to change this type as well to be it, along with the return type of the promise there. And that way all this logic can stay the same, but now it's just using that entity type, or that, yeah. So therefore all this logic can stay the same. It's just using that entity type because all the properties are still going to be the same on a score. There's a number of attempts, and that's what we care about to parse out from the data to determine winners. Lastly, as you can see from the squiggly right here, we need to update the inform latest results function to also handle this type. Paste that in there to replace the winners parameter or argument that gets passed in there. And we save our changes. And that completes the changes we need to do to index.ts. However, you should notice that there are some red squigglies going on here still. One thing that I almost forgot here that I noticed from this little squiggly error message is that argument of type Wordle result array is not assignable to parameter of type select score with relations result because this is not returning the correct type. We need to change that from Wordle result to select score with relations, and that fixes that problem as well. So now we're ready to go and implement these database functions: get scores by game number, create player, create Wordle, create score, and then we should be good to go and test things out. All right, so let's go and implement those functions in the database. We're going to go to src db index.ts for that one. We're going to make some changes here. All right, we're over in index.ts for the database now. We need to implement those functions. All right, so we're in index.ts of the database, and I'm going to copy over the code, just the code that I need to change. So all this can stay the same at the beginning here. You're just going to need to copy in the export async function, get scores by ID, and all the other functions that we have here. And we're going to paste that down below. And let's step through what is happening in these. All right, first thing we need to do is fix some little errors that are happening here. It doesn't know where this type is coming from. You can press Control period or Command period if you're on Mac OS, and we can say update import from Schema, and that will add this as type select score with relations there, and we got rid of that one. Then there's these other functions that are here. This is part of the Drizzle ORM library, and we need to add that into it. So we're going to press Command period or Control period on Windows and Linux to add the imports like that, to bring up this little message here, or this pop-up here. All right, so from this pop-up, we want to say add import from Drizzle ORM. And I think we have one more to do with that, which is the end function here. Control period, update import from Drizzle ORM. And now all those squigglies are gone. Things are happy. So let's talk about these functions and what they're doing. Get scores by game number. We receive the game number for the Wordle that we want to search for. And then we're going to use the database query scores table. This is coming from the schema again, scores table. We're going to say find many. We want to find any that have that game number, where scores table game number equals the game number we passed in. And remember what I was talking about earlier with that relationship, select score with relations. This tells the database or the ORM to create a query that also includes the player table data that's associated with that score. So we say with player equal to true, or set to true rather. And then we wrap that in a try catch, we log the error, and we return an empty array basically if nothing comes back, if there's some issue with that, so that we can handle that scenario if we'd like. In a similar fashion for create Wordle, it's doing what we were saying before, just using a different function. We're awaiting the db insert function against the Wordle's table, and then the values we want to insert, we're saying game number. And I added this on here so that if it already exists, meaning there's a conflict there, just do nothing. Let the operation just kind of fail silently. And when that goes through successfully without an error, we return true. Otherwise, we return false with a log of that error for that. Just like create Wordle, we have create player doing the same thing, but now we're passing in the player's table, and the values are Discord ID and Discord name received from the function parameters there. Also doing on conflict do nothing. And then last but not least is create score. This is receiving in the Discord ID for the player that score is for, the game number for the Wordle game that is, the number of attempts the player took, and whether or not we determine that is a winner or a tie for that player. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say db insert the scores table, those values that we received in the function. And then on conflict, we're doing nothing. And then we want to return the result of that, the entity of that, and that gets assigned here in the result variable. We check to see if that length is equal to 0, meaning it wasn't actually inserted, and we return undefined. Otherwise, we're going to find the first entry in the scores table for that score that's associated with this result, where the scores table game number matches the game number we just used and the Discord ID, including the player now. Because, at least from what I can tell, based on the current version of Drizzle ORM that I'm using, I've not been able to successfully find capabilities within it to return the score along with the player. So that's why I'm doing this right now. But at the time that you're watching this, that may change, and it may be possible that you return the relation table along with the original data after the insert happens. So that's a current limitation that I've run into. So I have to make an extra database operation to go and get that score with the player data, and then I return that score back to the calling function that might be using this create score function. Okay, so hopefully that helps explain everything that's going on and what this code is doing so that we can move on to the next step. Speaking of next step, it's time to test everything. So we need to get this up and running. So first of all, let's get Drizzle Studio running again. That way we can access the data and confirm that the data shows up in the database after we enter a Wordle result in the Discord server. So now that that's up and running, we need to actually run the bot again. So I'm going to create a new terminal. I'm going to say bun run src index.ts. So the bot is listening to messages, and we can see again, like from earlier, that logged in as WordleBot number 9389. So now we can head on over to the Discord server and send in a Wordle result to test it out. All right, we are back over in the Discord server. I'm going to paste in my Wordle results for the day for number 1276. I hit enter. We could see it. The bot was really snappy. It gave me an answer that I am the current winner with 4 attempts. So let's go double check the database now with Drizzle Studio to see if that shows up there. All right, so I opened up Drizzle Studio in my browser. Again, that's local.drizzle.studio. And you can refresh the page, or you can actually, let me make it a little bit smaller. There's a little refresh button in the top right-hand corner if you need to, if you're not seeing the data show up. And we can see there is a player now, Clarkio test account. All right, and then we can switch over to the scores table. We can see that for that Discord ID and the particular game number of the Wordle, 1276, we got 4 attempts on that. And last but not least, we can see the Wordle. And as I mentioned earlier, you can click on the scores and you can see the scores associated with that Wordle, and same for players. You can see all the scores associated with that too. All right, so something that's not part of the tutorial, but is a challenge for you as somebody looking to learn how to do all of this, you might have noticed that it didn't actually store whether the player is a winner, even though in the response from the bot in the Discord channel, it showed that Clarkio test account was a winner. It did not update in the database for that. So this is a little challenge for you if you'd like to. If not, don't worry about it. You can skip it, but I want you to add code to the project such that it can track and record the winner or the ties whenever that happens when somebody submits a Wordle result. And I'll give you a hint. Your hint is if you head on over to your code again, if you go to the index.ts one, not the database one just yet, right here, when we're running the process current results function, after you check that the winner's length is greater than 0, this is where you're going to want to record the winners to the database. And with that, you're going to need to update scores that are already been added in the database with those columns, whether that should be a win or a tie or not. Okay. And as an added hint to that, the other thing you're going to need to do is add a function in here that is update score instead of create score. So feel free to pause the video and go and try that out yourself. But otherwise, we're going to start wrapping things up for this video. All right, that does it for everything we were going to cover in this video. If you stick around for the next video, we're going to talk about deploying this bot so that it's not just running on our local machines all the time and dependent upon that, but it's actually hosted somewhere else that can be running 24/7 for you. That does it for this video. If you got value out of it, be sure to like it down below and share it with someone who could put it to use. And if you made it this far, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and happy, safe coding, everyone.